today we're going to be talking about female and male features. And so I'm going to introduce you to my little friend right here, to Leah and Leo right here. So let's start by looking at their faces a little bit closer up, right? So what makes the difference between drawing a male and a female face? First things that you want to notice are the face shape and the jaw shape. When it comes to traditional male faces tend to have squarer jaws, broader jaws, so it tends to have more angles, sort of like that. Now, in more cartoony or stylized drawings, you can exaggerate it and make it even more square to exaggerate sort of the strong, broad chin kind of idea. So like you might have like a very muscly kind of warrior type with strong brows. And a wider nose and like a really strong chin, something like that. And this reads as a very strong character because of that very shorter, more rectangular kind of vibe. Whereas for females, traditionally, or the most basic female face, you're going to see a lot more curves. You're going to see faces that look more like ovals, heart shapes, anything, even a little upside down pear shape. But basically, if you can think of curves, being able to draw a smoother facial shape where it's going to communicate more of a feminine feel. The next thing that you typically want to pay attention to when you're drawing faces between male and female faces are the eyes. So typically for females, you're going to see a lot bigger eyes, right? Because bigger eyes typically communicate sort of innocent looks. So her eyes here are a lot bigger than his eyes. And because of that, you kind of see sort of a very Disney look, and it communicates that kind of feeling of femininity. Not to say that men can't have larger eyes, but when they do, it's typically still going to reside in a specific location. So you can see that female, the eye distance between the eyes and the eyebrows tend to be larger, whereas for males, it's going to be slightly smaller. So even if a guy were to have pretty large eyes, right? Let's draw one male face real quick. Keep in mind that the chin is slightly broader than a typical oval or egg shape, right? Draw your guideline marks, put in your eyebrows, and I'm going to make his eyes equally as big as her eyes, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to place them a lot higher up, closer to his eyebrows. Right, so even though his eyes are now a lot bigger, his overall face still reads somewhat male because I placed his eyes a lot closer to his eyebrows, leaving little lid space. And when you do that, that's just going to read as more of a masculine face. Same thing goes for if you put smaller eyes on a female, but maintain that distance from the eyebrow. So we're gonna keep this, do ourselves a really generic oval face. Put in her eyebrows. And you can see right there, still reads somewhat as a feminine face, but because the lid space is larger than say you would do for a male face, it's reading as a female. I briefly mentioned this, but as we were talking about eyes, I mentioned stuff about eyebrows, and so there's also a little tiny nuance when it comes to drawing eyebrows for men and female. For female, you're going to have a lot more variety. You're going to be able to do things like the classic Nike eyebrow. I'm pretty sure this makeup trend has faded out by now, but I mean, it creates a very strong, fierce kind of look regardless of the fashion trend, right? You can do these, you can do a thinner, softer brow transition, maybe something like this, or you can even do a really straight eyebrow like in Korean makeup. Regardless, females will typically highlight this space, this brow bone space. They're typically going to have a stronger arch than say for men. For men, if you put in a arch, they're going to start reading more feminine. So even if they have a top arch, their bottom eyebrow is never going to really arch that crazily. It's mostly going to stay somewhat straight or slightly curved. It's never going to do like a really crazy this kind of eyebrow because that's going to read more feminine. And so some varieties of eyebrows you might see on male are the very strong, boxy, straight eyebrow like this. One with the typical extra little dingy up on top that stretches up into their temple region right here. Some might even have a very sparse tail end. Some might even do this type of eyebrow shape. But regardless, typically male eyebrows tend to be stronger, thicker, and that will communicate more masculine look. So if you were to apply that same logic for females, if you use a thicker eyebrow, she's going to look a lot more fierce than say if you use like a thinner, much softer curving kind of eyebrow. Now as for noses, male noses tend to be slightly wider, whereas females will be a lot thinner and smoother, sort of like that. And you can see in my previous example where I drew a very masculine, very warrior-like burly kind of soldier with his wider nose, creates that very tough, very war-like kind of vibe, or even ogre-like vibe. And the nose width also depends on ethnicity at times, but as a general rule, I typically like to draw the nose somewhat around inner corner, maybe even slightly wider, depending on how fierce I want my character to look. If in this case, you see right here, if you draw that nose wider, it's going to create this kind of very flared out, very angry kind of vibe. Whereas if you draw it a lot closer to just the inner corners, you look more reserved, more calm. Same goes for mouth. The mouth typically for males will be a lot wider than say for females. Of course, when you're exaggerating expressions, that's not going to be a concern because when you smile, you're obviously going to try to exaggerate and stretch the lips. But if you're drawing the lips for a female who's not smiling, you'll probably draw it shorter than say for a male. Let's draw this right here. Real quick sketches right now. Let's give ourselves a doe eye character right here. Right, and you see that very soft eyebrow curve, even though her eyebrows are relatively thick, because they're a soft round kind of shape and we gave plenty of space between her eyes and her eyebrows, it's reading as very feminine, very innocent, very cute. Little button nose. You see her lips are just lining up right at the inner corners, right? Whereas for a male face, we might do it slightly larger, slightly wider, just to communicate kind of that stoutness feeling, you know? And again, I'm making sure that I don't do too crazy of a curve for his eyebrows. Reserving that curve for the upper eyebrow. And we're going to do his eyes slightly closer to his eyebrows. It doesn't have to be super, super close because there are variations, especially between ethnicities or depending on how you want your characters to look. See, if you have a wider mouth, it's going to look more male, whereas if you have a smaller mouth, it's going to look very dainty, right? Almost as if like he's super reserved, something's wrong with him. He's holding back a little dirty little secret or something. And I mentioned that you don't necessarily have to do the eyebrow super, super close to the eyebrow or the eye to the eyebrow, because the implications of doing that are when your eyebrows are super close to your eyes, you're going to get hooded eyes, and as such, you're going to get a very angry character. And that implies a very strong brow. So basically when your eyebrows are basically touching your eyes and you can't see the upper lid or eyelid, you get a very angry looking character like this. Or even if you're not even angry, but you just have a very sly character. That lack of space makes it usually cast a really dark shadow like this, and it makes the character seem a lot more mysterious or a lot more mature looking, right? So like this might be like an elf who's had to fight a lot of battles, hence why his face is scarred up or something like that. Whereas this guy's just really angry about something, right? Now, say same for females. If you apply that same distance to their eyes, it's never going to really white touch the eyebrows, just because that will then read more masculine rather than as feminine. Let's try and put it really close to the eyebrows, right? And we're going to put in their arch. And your Seika is going to look slightly strange just because we're not used to seeing females with such close distances from their eyes to the eyebrows. But it definitely does create this sort of closed off look, creates a kind of looking upwards perspective. And so whenever you're trying to draw someone who's looking up at you and they're maybe like facing this way, you're gonna always make sure that the upper lid is gonna be hidden and you're only gonna see the bottom lid and you're only gonna see the eyebrows. Just like that. Right, something like that. it looks like they're looking at you from, giving you that glare, maybe looking at you from their face like that. And so some other things to consider when you're drawing a female and male face is their side profile and their 3/4 profile. So from the side, male noses are obviously going to have a little bit of a straighter, higher nose bridge. It's going to have their nose bridge starting quite high up here. So if I were to draw this, here's their eye, their nose bridge would probably start a little bit higher up, though there are variations depending on ethnicity, but they tend to have a straighter nose bridge, a longer nose, just to convey that sort of masculine look, whereas females are able to be a little bit softer curve right here, and you might see some noses even being super low down, like in Disney movies where their nose bridges basically curve all the way down before finally coming out to their little bulb of their nose, right? And that creates a very childlike face, which has sometimes been used to equate to feminine looks, in which case that's why we see feminine noses being a little bit softer in their nose bridge, like that. Right? Reads very childlike. And male, and following up from that nose, male brows are trying to be a little stronger and their forehead is going to slope a little less than for females. Their forehead typically goes a little more perpendicular, more straight up, although there is still a slight curve. And especially if you have stronger Neanderthal genes, it's going to be even more straightforward. So like, and have like a very sudden curve to the skull, and this creates a very strong, again, a very strong warrior kind of vibe. See, compare this to say this, right? Whereas for females, their forehead is relatively rounder. It might even slope backwards more sideways rather than upwards, like this, to create a very soft, very gradual change in the skull structure. And as for 3/4, you're going to see that brow bone come into play. So for male, typically their brow bone is going to stick out over their cheek. So you're going to get this kind of little gap right here. Whereas for females, that gap is typically either straight or it's going to push out this way. So either the brow bone is going to be the same length or height, I guess, as the cheek, or you're going to get that cheek poking out just a little bit more. Just like in the Sleeping Beauties. Right, just oh so slightly. It's like, don't go too crazy overboard or you're going to end up with a very flatter face, because when you do the eyebrow further back from the cheek, the face ends up looking a little whack. So if we were to do our eyebrows a lot further back than the cheek, it's going to look really weird. Like your skull structure will fall through because you don't have that balance. And so you're going to always make sure that when you're drawing female faces, either the eyebrow lines up with that cheek, just like that, just like in the Sleeping Beauties. Ooh, I'm a Disney character. Drawn the most generic Disney princess you could ever see. Perhaps she looks familiar. We don't know. Maybe she's an amalgamation of all the Disney characters. I'll let you figure that out, right? Or we're gonna draw the eyebrows only oh so slightly further back to kind of create the silhouette of people from Asian descent, because their eyebrows tend to be less prominent in their facial structures. And because of all the fat that's in their monolid, it's going to create that look of basically it's a very flat silhouette. See, when you push the eyebrows just slightly back, it helps sell the idea of drawing someone who's from an Asian descent. Whereas if maybe your eyebrows are lining up with your cheek, it's just going to be very stereotypical, very more Westerner kind of proportion, or more cartoon-like proportion, right? And some final thoughts about the jaw and overall face shape is that when you compare the two, you see you're going to make sure that you're going to have your strong chin line, whereas this is a softer slope. Side profile, the chin right here is broader, more square than, say, for females, a softer gradual decline. And don't forget that males typically have an Adam's apple, so you can include that in either subtly, or in some cases some of their Adam apples are pretty obvious. So a more subtle maybe looks something like this, where it's just a slight bump, or a more exaggerated Adam's apple might look like this. And by exaggerating it, you create this sort of wily, very skinny, very nervous kind of character. And males will typically have a thicker neck than females. See here, thicker neck right here. It lines up with the jawline, whereas the females, it's smaller than the jaw, and that creates a sense of like big head, tiny body kind of vibe, obviously. And for lips, again, females will typically have thicker lips. You will see females have lips like this, like this, like this, or whatnot, right? But for males, typically, if you want to create a more masculine look, you will tend to want to do thinner lips. Say like with this elf creature right here, or for this really strong kind of warrior vibe, they're gonna have thinner lips. But of course, there are variations, and you're gonna see males with thicker lower lips, like in this case right here with Leo. Leo here has thicker lips, bottom lips, but his upper lip is still pretty thin, and that will help read as more masculine than, say, feminine. And whereas for Leah, you can see she has a little bit thicker of an upper lip, but of course I decided for her character it would be suitable for her to have a thinner upper lip, just so she reads more as a very mature character rather than, say, like a more social media kind of character, like say with this character right here. When you make her lips thicker, she reads as super feminine, and I kind of wanted to create two opposite characters right here that are sort of similar together. So by keeping her upper lip thinner, sort of like Leo's, it helps read as these are counterparts rather than two separate characters. And so in the class exercise, I'm going to have you design a character and then switch it up and create the counterpart of that character. And that will help you practice on what parts are you specifically changing in order for it to look more masculine or feminine, right? All right, let's put this aside for a second, and let's talk about androgyny, or how do you mix up these features to create a face that's not quite feminine or not quite masculine. And so when it comes to androgyny, a very important aspect of it is you want to determine whether you want it to be predominantly male or predominantly female, because creating a perfect androgynous character is really difficult. And so things that you're going to want to consider when you're doing an androgynous character, or a character who maybe is male but looks more feminine, or a female that looks more masculine, right? So again, we're going to go over the things that I talked about just earlier. You're going to want to pay attention to, one, their eyebrows, whether or not they have that arch, how thick are they, whether or not you're going to make them close to the eyes, like the distance, that kind of thing. So arch, thickness, distance to eye. And number two, you're going to consider is the size of the eyes. Are we gonna make them bigger? Just like you're popping them out because you saw a piece of cake lying out of there and it's free and there's no reason to turn down free cake, right? Bigger, or you can make them smaller because you want to seem like a very mysterious, very sleepy kind of person, right? Next, you're going to consider the nose bridge, the nose. So we're going to talk about how tall the nose bridge. How wide the nose. And then whether or not you're going to make it straighter / longer, because that's going to read more masculine. Another thing to consider, jaw shape. Are we going to go for softer? Or are we going for stronger, more angular? Lips, thickness, the width of the lips, and finally we're going to consider whether or not their neck is going to be thicker, more muscular, more slender, and whether or not, you know, they're gonna reach up to your jaws. And so I created this real quick character that mixes some of the features that I talked about, being more masculine and more feminine. So for this character, I decided I wanted to create a thicker jaw, but while retaining sort of a more smoother transition between the jawline. I added slender neck. The mouth is a little bit wider, but the lips are thick. The eyes are slightly smaller, but we're maintaining sort of a middle ground distance between the eyebrow and the eyes. The eyebrows are relatively straight and thick, so they're reading a little more masculine, and the nose is a little much stronger, very strong nose bridge, a little bit wider also, so it's reading more masculine. And so you can see this character is reading a little bit more masculine because I chose more features that appear masculine, but they also still look sort of feminine because I did a mixture between the two sort of contrasting features, right? And so we can try this, we can do one together where I do a character that looks more feminine, but they have more masculine traits, right? And so let us try drawing one ourselves. And so because this jawline is more masculine, this time we're going to do a more feminine jawline, right? We're going to do one that's a little shorter, a little rounder. Put in our ears, middle ground. And the thing about androgyny is you don't want to go too crazy into one side. And so even if I'm making the jaw rounder, I have to make sure the jaw looks somewhat more thin, a little bit more angular on that side in order to appeal as a little bit male. And this time maybe I'm doing slightly thicker neck, not too much thicker. We're gonna give ourselves an eyebrow arch. Maybe this character is like an evil witch or something. Yeah, let's try creating a character that's sort of a rich millionaire or something. So they're gonna have their gorgeous pearls or whatnot. in their schmexy fur coat because they are rich like that. I want to make sure the eye distance is slightly larger to read as feminine, but their eyes are going to be very small or thinner. We're going to make sure their nose bridge is long, but small. Because the features of this character is very slim, very elegant kind of vibe. Their lips, we're going to create thinner lips. And we're going to give them maybe a real tight cut. Just like that, right? Maybe their hair is done up real nice, like those chaebols from Korean dramas. And so you can see here, this character reads as overall more feminine, but you can sort of still recognize that there are a little bit more masculine traits of this character. And so if they were to, say, dress it up, say if I were to cut that hair of theirs, right? Remove those earrings, get rid of that lipstick. Well, I don't want to get rid of it right now. Okay, we're gonna cover it up here. Right, get rid of that lipstick. Give them a suit instead of a dazzling fur coat. Not that men can't have dazzling fur coats, so maybe I'll keep that, but I'll give them also a nice suit so they look tight as hell. Cover up those pearls, instead give them a nice little suit. And thicken up their eyebrows even more. And there, already this character looks slightly more masculine, although you can flip back and forth. Let's give them back their hair. Give them their earrings because they deserve it. And we're back to our classic chaebol rich woman vibe, right? And so understanding which features to pick out to alterate to create androgyny or a more interesting looking character will be very important when you're designing characters in the future, because it helps tell so much about their personality. Because in this case, this character right here has such long, strong features. She gives off the character traits as being strong, very cold, calculating, very strong, sort of on the upper echelon, like you can't reach them, right? Whereas, say, go back to our original little sketches, say this character where their features are like super feminine, right? They give off a very innocent, very naive kind of personality. And so that's for faces, and I'll do a real quick rundown about male and female bodies just as a preview for when we do figures soon in a couple videos later, but I just want to give you a taste on how you want to think about angles and softer features, which are kind of a big overarching theme when it comes to knowing how to draw male and female features. So let's pop these out. So for male, if we're keeping in line with the whole angles are their whole shtick thing, face as a rectangle, neck is wider. You won't be expected to do any of these for this lesson, but of course I just want to give you a taste so you understand just how angles and curves play into the overall stereotypes that comes when you're drawing female or more traditionally male characters, right? And lucky you, you're getting a preview of how I do figures. Shrink that down. Okay, so we're going to designate this as male, this as female. So we're going to make their head shapes about the same size so it doesn't get too confusing. Alright, so I laid down their skeleton, so I'm going to real quickly fill in that form. The reason I'm able to do this is because I've had a lot of figure drawing practice, and so I sort of understand already the underlying anatomy of male and female figures. But when we do get to talking about drawing figures in like a couple videos later, I'll be teaching you on how you can build that skill yourself, and so you will be able to really quickly draw basically any figure you want. Alright, so got that rough sketch done. Let's do this rough sketch real quickly. Put in their arms. Alright, and we're gonna clean up the sketch real quick. Don't worry, you're gonna see less of these ugly marks, and you're gonna finally see actual human bodies. So we're not going to bother with the hands because the hands are a different lesson also. But just notice just how I made the shoulders slightly wider than say for a female. The chest sits higher up than say for females. And the male body is a lot more rectangular than say for a female. So you're going to see a lot more straight lines rather than curves. Say for females, you're going to see that their hips are wider than their ribs typically. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, especially with different types of body types, like say rectangular body types, pear-shaped, hourglass, etc. But the general idea is that you make the hips wider in order to create a more feminine look. Right, let's give them belly button. Again, this is like super rough, super quick, trying to just show you quickly the main differences and how you can see angles and curves will play into part even in the bodies, as we've talked about in this lesson with the faces. So we're just going to put in triangle Lego feet for them right now because I can't be bothered to render them real quick. Give them a face so they're not mannequins, although they're technically just mannequins at this point. Right, might as well go full on into the mannequin idea. Okay, cover that up. So for male, for female. And so what you're going to notice here is the width of the shoulder. You can see just how much more of a rectangular shape the male form is, whereas female form is a lot more slopier. Sort of like a pear's. You're going to get that Dorito shape, ideally, whereas females, you're going to get more of a balanced shape. Muscles tend to be more poppier, which means that you're basically adding a sort of angle in a metaphorical sense, whereas female arms might be more slender, thinner. Same goes for the legs and how straight or not straight it is. Female legs are going to have more curve because the hips are wider, whereas male is going to be relatively straight, just like that. And so that's just basic ideas of how to distinguish between male and female features. And we also talked a little bit about androgyny, and hopefully that was helpful for you understanding how to design characters that may not necessarily fit the mold of, say, a traditional male or female archetype kind of traits, right? So in summary, just remember, I think I've mentioned this like 3 million times, but it doesn't hurt for me to just, say it in a different way. Maybe it'll click better with you, right? Just keep in mind, you want pay attention to the eye shape, eye distance from the eyebrows, the archiness of your eyebrows, whether or not your jaw shape is more soft, angular, thickness of the neck, width of the nose, how long is the nose bridge, etc. Just things, if you can think of angular shapes for male, more round shapes for females, I think is a good indicator for how you're going to mix these two features. Like maybe you'll end up with like a very curvy kind of pentagon or something, or those types of shapes where you're blending between lines and curves, and you'll be able to achieve sort of like more androgynous looks or more, say, more unique characters that don't necessarily fit like the mold, right? Because people in real life don't always fall categorically into one particular look or one particular like feature kind of thing. So why make characters that fall under, right, those specific archetypes, right? So hopefully that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video. Later!